Evening. It's very good to see all of you here. Going on into getting into the Bible study here this evening. We last time focused in on the reign of King Solomon, and this evening we're getting into the time that begins with the split between Israel and Judah. Now, if you'll note on the chronology of Kings and Chronicles chart that I passed out, we come down to the division of the kingdom, which is approximately 922 BC. Some you may find dates that will vary 1 or 2 years from this, from some of these dates on here, but I think most of them are very close. Sometimes you hard to always pin everything down to the exact year. I might mention, just to give you a little bit of a background on it, I don't want to get off into the details of bogged down with chronology, but we are this evening, of course, picking the story up and bringing it down to the days from the split in the kingdom down to the time of King Ahab of Israel and Jehoshaphat of Judah, which was also the time period of Elijah's prophetic ministry. Now, if you were to go through and do a little figuring, clearly Israel and Judah both began the same year. They began when Solomon died. One of the problems that comes up in Bible chronology, if you go through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, you find that the kings are dated, the kings of Israel and Judah are dated in relationship to one another. In the such and such year of, King so-and-so, then King such and such became king of Judah. Well, one of the interesting things you will find if you go through there and add it up, starting with the reigns of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, you'll find that the kings of Judah, if you come on down to the death of Omri of Israel, you find that according to the listing that it gives for the kings of Israel, that's 48 years. If you add it up with Judah, you come up with 52 years. And then you're scratching your head and you're saying, well, wait a minute, they started at the same time, you're only coming down a few kings, coming down 4 kings, how do you get a difference of 4 years? And there's a reason as to why you do. And it is one of the keys to being able to coordinate the reigns of Israel and Judah, and it can be done. But there are a couple of different problems that come up with figuring chronology. One has to do with when do you begin the year. There were 2 times that the year could be begun in ancient Israel. You could begin in the spring or you could begin in the fall. And this was not only the case in Israel, this was the case in various countries there in that whole Middle Eastern area. Israel, from a religious standpoint, the standpoint of the calendar and a religious standpoint, the month Abib or Nisan in the spring was always month 1, and you counted from there. But the civil year, that was the way the religious year ran, and the indication is that Israel, the northern kingdom, normally used a spring-to-spring reckoning for their kings. But there was also a fall-to-fall reckoning. And when you look in the Bible, you find that, for instance, the year of the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year, they didn't begin in the spring, they began in the fall. The agricultural year, the year for figuring tithes and taxes, was figured from fall to fall because that represented the end of the harvest, and that was another logical cutoff. So what we find, I don't want to get into the details of it because you can bog down, but if anybody is particularly interested, I have a very good article on the subject from Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible on biblical chronology that goes through and shows that Judah during most of the time of the kingdom of Judah used a fall to fall reckoning. Israel used a spring to spring. So what it meant was that the difference was depending on when in the year. The other aspect of it was kings didn't normally die and a new one succeed. King didn't always die on the last day of the year, and the new king took over on the first day of the first month the next year. So what you find then is, how do you count that last year? Do you count it? And there were two ways of doing it. One was where the last year, however, if the old king's reign went past the first of the year, then that whole year was counted as his, and that was only the accession year of the new king, and his year one would start at the new year. And the other way of doing it was to wind up and count that year as both the last year of the old king and the first year of the new king. That's why you wind up going through 4 kings with 4 years worth of difference when you add up the king's reign with Israel and Judah. And there are several examples that you can look at, and it had to do with the way of counting it. Neither one was inaccurate. If you knew what the system was, if you knew what the system the scribe was using, it made perfect sense and it lined up. But it is one of those things that a lot of critics would throw up their hands and say, well, the Bible contradicts itself. Well, no. It's a matter of when you understand it, you line it up, you can go through, and it just, the whole thing meshes perfectly, and all of these things, they all fit in together. And there have been increasingly in recent years several, let's say, secular sources. There is a chronicle, a Babylonian chronicle, that records every new moon for a period of about 250, 300 years. It was an ancient chronicle from Babylon, and the Chronicle of Babylonian History, well, they named each year, and they recorded the new moon. And so that was when that was discovered back several years ago, that was a very handy thing, because it gave a cross-reference. And there are events, there have been records, let's say Assyrian records, Assyrian monuments that refer by name to certain kings of Israel and Judah. Omri, the king of Israel, is referred to on several of the monuments. Jehu is recorded. In fact, there's what, as far as can be told, is actually a picture, the only picture we have of any of the kings of ancient Israel and Judah. There is actually a picture of Jehu, at least presenting this tribute to the king of Assyria. And there is sort of a stylized picture, but it is a picture that's carved on there of him, and it's got his name, it's got the record on there. You see Jehu, it calls him king of the house of Omri. That was the name the Assyrians stuck on Israel, and the result of that was that the name that Israel actually carried into captivity, and the Assyrian monuments of the captivity refer to the house of Omri, which in Assyrian was Beit Humri, and that's where the term Cimmerian, which is the name that ultimately the Gauls and the Celts and everything, the name that they carried. You can read about that in the booklet that's available, by the way, free of charge. It goes into a little of that. I won't rehearse that, but it's interesting how so many of the so-called Bible critics have wanted to discount the historical value of the Bible. and say, well, these things, they were written down centuries later based on oral tradition, and the country just tried to aggrandize their history and do all of this. And more, as more things are discovered, what you find is a correlation. You find secular records from particularly from Babylon and from Assyria, some from Egypt, that make very direct reference. It also enables us to cross-check some of these dates, because sometimes the Bible will tell you, for instance, it talks about the invasion of Sennacherib being the 14th year of King Hezekiah. Well, there's actually a monument that's been excavated that is the monument that Sennacherib that records Sennacherib's invasion of Israel and Judah, and mentions Hezekiah by name, and refers to certain things. And so, the Assyrian records record exactly which year it was in the reign of Sennacherib. It was his last year, and gives some of this connecting information, you see, that enables us to put the story together and to confirm and shore up certain dates. So I think that most all of our dates are very close. There's always the possibility of it. There are technical things as to why it can sometimes be a little bit off, because there's more than one way of interpreting the information, but it's usually not very much, and a lot of it can be pretty well documented to the year. Now, what we find is, in terms of the material we're going through this evening, is that what Solomon sowed was reaped by his son. Solomon had made decisions and choices that brought consequences. Everything didn't fall apart during his lifetime, but when he died, it really began to. And, there's so many different lessons that you can learn. You can read the Bible on many different levels. You can read it from the standpoint of obviously looking for the revelation of God's plan and purpose and spiritual revelation. There's a matter of history and just understanding that. There are many principles about human relationships, about leadership, about things that lead to success and failure, both on, let's say, a national level and on a family level, that we can all glean from examples and illustrations in the Bible. Rehoboam, I think, is interesting as you look at him and think about, here is a man who has now come to be king. His father was a very strong, dominant personality, a man who cast a long shadow. He was a man of worldwide reputation. He was, the wisest man who lived. He was a man of exceptional intellect and ability. The nation had achieved great power during his reign. So he's a man that really left big shoes to fill. Rehoboam comes in, and it's clear right at the beginning, a problem erupts regarding the taxes and the change of administration. People view, so they've got nerve enough to say things to Rehoboam that they were sort of intimidated by Solomon, you see, and they didn't show up and tell Solomon those things. But now the new guys come along, and so they're going to, they feel sort of emboldened. They're going to get things off to a right start. Rehoboam gets some good advice from the older men who had been Solomon's advisors. But Rehoboam doesn't like that advice, because it's sort of like he's chafing at the bit that he wants everybody to know that he's just as much king as his father ever was. So you can just almost sense it. You can compare it even on the level of many jobs. Here you got the new guy who's come along, and he's fresh out of college. He's out there and a little bit of what you call the first lieutenant, the new lieutenant syndrome. He's he's in charge. He wants everybody to know he's in charge. And these old guys that have been around for a while, they may have had experience, but he's going to let them know he's the boss. They better do what he says. And you can just imagine that you can just sort of, as you read it, sense how, in his mind, his father's advisors didn't take him as seriously as they took his father. I'm sure he could pick up on that, the way they talked to him, but they didn't seem to be nearly as impressed with him as they had with his father. And he resents that, Maybe he felt like these guys had sort of seen him grow up, and they were giving him some advice, and he resented that. He didn't like that. And so then he talked to his buddies, who were just as young and inexperienced as he was, and they said, well, what you need to do is you need to let those folks know who's in charge. You make sure they know who's in charge. You tell them, you think my dad was tough? I'm going to show you what tough is. He chastised you with whips. I'm going to chastise you with scorpions. You go out there and you let them know who's in charge. Well, I'll tell you, if you have to show up somewhere and continue to be telling people that you're in charge, it's probably a pretty good indication that you aren't. If they can't figure it out from just the way you handle things, there's probably a problem. See, Rehoboam reacted on this. It's important for us to learn, because I'll tell you what, I think we had, in many ways, sort of a replay of some of that when Joe DeKotch took over from Mr. Armstrong. And it was like, don't want to talk to the old advisors, the ones that were his advisors, because they don't look up to me quite the way they looked up to Mr. Armstrong. But my son and his friends, they're impressed with me. I surround myself with them. And I don't want to get off on that, but I think there is a parallel. It struck me that way years ago, and it played out just about as disastrously. As we read these examples and stories, we're not just reading long ago history. We are reading history. What's the best psychology book that's ever been written? The Bible. Who is the creator of the human psyche, of the human mind and emotions and everything? The one, God understands human nature better than, and I understand, there are men who, based on observation, have come to some pretty sound conclusions and they have some helpful things, but none of them can even come close to having as accurate an analysis as God does. And there's so many different levels to look at. And Rehoboam, Jeroboam is an excellent study on that, and the kinds of things that, because here were men, both of whom wound up really being real failures in terms of achieving what they sought to achieve. And there are reasons for that. As we understand the reasons why some succeeded and some failed, we are at an advantage in terms of our own circumstances, because we can take and apply those principles. So we find that that Israel, of course, the 10 tribes chose their own king. They chose Jeroboam as their king. And we come really to a very crucial section, and God sort of slows down in some of these accounts. What you find is sometimes one chapter suffices to take care of 2 or 3 kings, and in other cases you slow down. And when you get to the split of the kingdom and some of the events directly surrounding that, you find that things slow down. Chapters 12 and 13 sort of slow down here, 1 Kings, and focus on the events of the dividing of the kingdom. We find chapter 12, of course, tells about the revolt, which taxes were the sort of the instigating factor. It's interesting. Politics hasn't changed a whole lot. This is now in the American presidential politics. See, this is the big This is the big thing that's going on. They're beginning to argue back and forth as to which one's going to raise taxes and which one's going to lower taxes. You know, Samuel told them when they wanted a king, God says, all right, I'm going to give you what you asked for. You're going to cry out to me by reason of the taxes, and I'm not going to listen. He's going to come. What's the first thing the king's going to do? He's going to institute a tax, see, and he's going to start you're going to find that more and more of your resources are drained off. Well, the situation came along, and Rehoboam rejected the counsel of the older men. Now, at this point, and it was God's intent, you know, God sees the character of people, and He sees where things were leading, and Solomon had made mistakes, and so now Jeroboam becomes king of Israel. He's chosen. And we find in verse 25 of chapter 12, Jeroboam built Shechem in Mount Ephraim and dwelt there. And then we find that Jeroboam said in his heart, this is verse 26, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David if this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then shall the heart of this people return again to their Lord, to Rehoboam. They'll kill me and go to Rehoboam. And, you know, here is a perfect example of somebody projecting, borrowing trouble. I read a definition one time that said, worry is the interest you pay on troubles you borrow. And that's what Jeroboam did. See, he was borrowing trouble. Now, looking at it on one level, from a human standpoint, his analysis made sense. He knew that the honeymoon phase would come to an end. There are people who don't know that. They expect it to go on forever, and then they're shocked when it doesn't. You know, the honeymoon phase, when Jeroboam was the new king, people saw no fault in him. Boy, they knew he was going to be so much better than the last guy, and he was going to do good, and he'd made all these promises. They were all excited. Now they weren't going to have to be taking orders from Jerusalem anymore. They were going to have their own thing, and you know, just all the hoopla that goes with something new. But you know what happens is, eventually the excitement settles down, and then you get down to just having to live day in and day out, and you find out there's still problems. There's still, life goes on. And people get dissatisfied. There's no leader that's going to come along and always satisfy all of the people all of the time. Can't happen. Jeroboam knew that he would make decisions that would be unpopular. And, you know, the leader who sets out to always make the popular decision, you can go back and read the life of Saul and find what happened. You know, over and over his excuse would be, well, I feared the people. I was afraid of what they'd think, so I did this, did that. Well, he wound up and his circumstance didn't work out. Jeroboam says, I need to make sure that nostalgia for the good old days doesn't set in. I've got to block that. If they keep going up there, you know, they're not having to live with that day in and day out. They're having to live with me. And so it'll be easy, it'll be easy for Rehoboam to put his best foot forward. All he's got to do is welcome them to the feast and make a short speech, and everybody's glad to see old friends, and they're having a big time, and they spend all their second tithe, and then they go back home, and life sets in again. And so he analyzed this thing through. But, you know, he left the most important part of the equation out. The most important part of the equation is God. Jeroboam left God out of the equation, and all he could look at was Rehoboam and himself and the people and trip and all of these physical circumstances. He left God out, and when he left God out, he came to a very flawed conclusion. That the way to permanently ensure the success of his dynasty was to keep the people away from Jerusalem. But you see, that involved keeping them away from doing what God said. So that involved taking himself out from under God's blessing. See, it goes to show that if God says do something, and you look at it and you analyze it and say, well, I don't see how it will work out better doing this way. I think maybe I ought to do the other. You can't afford to substitute human reasoning and human fears in place of faith. If God says it, you take it to the bank. It's sure. Well, Jeroboam, of course, set up the golden calf. If you're going to do that, well, then you got to have priests that'll preach what you pay them to preach. So get rid of the old bunch and hire folks that are looking for a job and you give them a list. What are the doctrines today? Oh yeah, I can preach those. If you change them tomorrow, well, I can preach those too. That was the kind of crowd that Jeroboam was looking for. The Bible says he made priests of the lowest of the people. People that were not individuals of integrity, people who, just a job to them. They would do what you paid them to do. Then he changed the feast, made a little difference, moved it to the 8th month. Again, trying to distance things from Jerusalem. Well, the chapter 13 tells the story that God sent a man out of Judah to Bethel. And Jeroboam was standing by the altar to burn incense. Now here's a very crucial chapter, because we've come to a pivot point in terms of the history of the nation, and God sends a warning. Now, when you come to a pivot point, when you come to a crucial time, God ensures that there is some sort of warning that is given. And Jeroboam is here in Bethel officiating at his altar, and this man of God shows up and pronounces a curse and says that there's going to come a time when a child born unto the house of David by the name of Josiah. And here is an event that was spoken. Here is Josiah mentioned by name well over 200 years, over 250 years before he was born. Josiah by name, and he is going to destroy his altar, and he's going to he's going to burn the bones of the pagan priests on this thing. And he said, now this is the sign that I'm not just saying this is what God says. The altar shall be rent, and the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out. Now he's saying all this, and Jeroboam hears it, and he's upset, and he puts forth his hand and he says, "Get that fellow." And that, of course, was the wrong thing to do, because the hand that he put forth dried up. He couldn't pull it back. It was just out there, it just sort of shrivels right there in front of everybody. What an amazing thing. And the altar, in the meantime, the altar splits in two and all the ashes pour out. Now, wouldn't you think at that point that Jeroboam would maybe do a little bit of analysis on this and figure, wait a minute, maybe we have started heading down the wrong direction. Wrong. He didn't get the point. Shows people can be pretty stubborn sometimes. And he was so locked in on what he wanted. So he changed his tune a little bit. He asked the man nicely. He said, please, entreat the face of the Lord your God and pray for me that my hand may be restored. And the man of God besought the Lord, and the king's hand was restored. And the king was, said, well, look, he said, why don't you come on home and have a meal with me? You can stay a little while. I'll give you a reward. He was, he didn't want his hand to get crippled again. And the man of God told him, said, I can't come to your house. I've gotten specific instructions from God, not to stop, not to eat or drink anything in this place. I was told, come up here and turn around and go back. And so he went back another way. Verse 10, now there was an old prophet in Bethel, and his sons came and told him all the things that the man of God had done. And the father, and we're going to see, it's interesting what his perspective on the whole thing was. he was thinking of himself. And when he heard this, he evidently, on one level, he believed it. He believed that the prophecy that this man had made, this man of God had made, was going to come to pass. And so he said, well, so he found out where he was, and he told his sons to get his donkey ready, and he rode off after him. He found the man sitting under a tree resting. And he asked him if you're the man of God, and he said yes. And he told him, verse 15, he says, well, come on home and have a meal with me. And the man of God said no. He says, I can't do that. I got specific instructions from God. I won't eat bread or drink water here in this place. And because that's what God told me to do. Verse 18, the man said, well, I'm a prophet just like you are. And, an angel came and told me to come out here and hunt you up and bring you back and give you something to eat. Now, he was lying. And the man of God went back and ate bread and drank water at his house. Now you think about why would he do that? Sometimes we have a habit of believing what's convenient or what we want to believe. By this time, the man of God was hungry and tired and thirsty, and he'd sat down under a tree to rest a little bit. And he was probably thinking, his mouth was dry, and he was thinking how good it would, sure would be good to drink water or have something to eat or drink. And here this fellow showed up and told him, said, oh, yeah, it's okay. Now, he had gotten his instructions directly from God, and God hadn't come to him and changed the instructions. Here's somebody that comes along and tells you, oh, that's okay, you can do that. Oh, yeah, you can work on the Sabbath. Yeah, you can eat pork. You can do these things. Oh, I can? God's changed his mind? Oh, well, good. Didn't work then, and it doesn't, that excuse doesn't wash. There are people, God speaks to us directly through his word. I mean, you can look, and he gives us direct instructions. There were people who were just like this man of God. They had direct instructions straight from God. A man came along and said, oh, well, we don't need to do that anymore. So they jumped up. Go do something else. Well, that's what this fellow did. It was sort of convenient. He liked to sort of go back and rest and get something to eat. Well, he did. And, of course, he shouldn't have. He had instructions from God. When you have instructions from God, and somebody comes along and says, well, you don't have to do that, that's not somebody you want to listen to. So then the word of God came, and it was the fact telling this man, look, didn't I tell you not to eat or drink here? You're going to die, and you're going to be buried here. You're not going to even be taken back home and buried with your family. So he left, and after he'd gone a little ways, verse 24, a lion came and slew him. And the lion didn't maul the carcass. The lion stood there, and the poor man was dead. Well, word of this got back to the old prophet. Now notice what his thinking was. He got his sons and found the man of God who was now dead, took him, brought him back, and gave him a burial in his own tomb. And then he told his sons, verse 31, when I'm dead, bury me in the sepulchre where the man of God is buried, and lay my bones beside his bones. For the saying which he cried by the word of the Lord against the altar in Bethel, and against all the houses of the high places in the cities of Samaria, shall surely come to pass. And, in other words, his thinking was, all right, they're going to come, they're going to take the bones of false prophets and burn them on the altar and desecrate their tombs. Not going to happen to me. I'm going to bury this man of God right over here, and when I die, you bury me with him, put me right up there next to him. When the time comes and they come to do this, well, they're not going to know they can't tell whose bones are who, and so they'll just leave it all alone. Now, you talk about a complicated way of, what about just repenting and not being a false prophet anymore? That would have been too simplistic a solution. it's amazing the trouble that people will go to. You know, it's sort of like a lot of crooks when you look at the schemes they do. You figure, you know, if they'd put as much effort into honest labor, they could have done just as well. But they went to all this trouble and risk trying to make a dishonest buck when they could have done it differently. Well, the whole point is Jeroboam didn't listen. And he didn't get the point. Not really. The priests and the Levites, of course, wound up having to leave from up in northern Israel, as we're told. It mentions this back in 2 Chronicles 11. This is the parallel account. We will primarily be going through the account in Kings and turning to Chronicles when the parallel adds in some details. The 2 Chronicles 11 mentions in verse 13, the priests and the Levites that were in all Israel resorted to him, to Rehoboam, out of all their coasts. The Levites left their suburbs, their possessions, came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had cast them off from executing the priest's office unto the Lord. He ordained him priests for the high places and for the demons and for the calves which he made. And so we find that the Levites, for the most part, the ones who were going to remain faithful to God, they had to leave up there because they couldn't stay there and obey God. As we come on down through the story here, back in 1 Kings, that 1 Kings 14 tells about Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, falling sick, and the son died, that Ahijah the prophet, who was the one who had actually prophesied of Jeroboam becoming king. Jeroboam had sent his wife to inquire of this elderly prophet, elderly by this time, and about his son. And, the message he sent back in 1 Kings 14, 7, go tell Jeroboam, thus says the eternal God of Israel, for as much as I exalted you from among the people and made you prince among my people Israel, and rent the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you, and yet you have not been as my servant David, who kept my commandments, who followed me with all his heart, to do that only which was right in my eyes. You've done evil. You've gone after other gods, and I'm going to bring evil on the house of Jeroboam. And he went on to explain that this young son of his, that he said in verse 13, all Israel shall mourn for him and bury him, for he only, Jeroboam, shall come to the grave, because in him there's found some good thing toward the Lord God. He's the only one in the whole family that's decent, and I'm just going to let him die, because I'm going to deal with you and the rest of the family. And the Lord will raise up another king over Israel who will cut off the house of Jeroboam. And so this was quite a message. And when his wife got back to tell Jeroboam what was said, the child died. And it all came to pass just as was said. Now, Jeroboam reigned, verse 20, 22 years, and his son Nadab reigned in his stead. And Rehoboam had reigned 17 years, we're told. And Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 22, Rehoboam wasn't a good king. And they built high places, verse 23, and images and groves. And there were sodomites in the land, verse 24. They did according to all the abominations of the nations. And it talks about Shishak of Egypt coming up in the 5th year of Rehoboam and taking away many of the treasures from the king's house and the Lord's house. And Rehoboam died, and Abijam, his son, reigned in his stead. And so we're told in chapter 15, in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijam reigned over Judah. Now, I just would call your attention with that. We're told Rehoboam, in verse 21, that Rehoboam reigned 17 years. Well, if Rehoboam had reigned 17 years, hadn't Jeroboam reigned 17 years? Jeroboam didn't become king until after Rehoboam. And yet, we're told over here, you see, that Abijam became king in the 18th year of Jeroboam. That's why I'm telling you, if you go through and you add it up, you can come to a slightly different. It was a different way of reckoning, just a slightly different way of reckoning that was there. So he reigned 3 years in Jerusalem, and he continued to do just what his father Rehoboam had done. And nevertheless, we're told in verse 4, for David's sake did the Lord his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem, set up his son after him. You see, even though these sons were getting off the track, Rehoboam wasn't really any better than Jeroboam. But the difference was God had made a promise to David. And God keeps his word. He made a promise to David. And Rehoboam came along, and he was a loser, and Jeroboam was just as much of a loser. But God hadn't made that promise to Jeroboam, and he told him, he said, if you'll walk in my ways, I'll give you a dynasty. Well, Jeroboam didn't walk in his ways, so he said, well, we're getting rid of you, your family. Rehoboam, on the other hand, didn't walk in the ways either, but God had made a promise to David, and so that dynasty continued on. Abijam only reigned for 3 years. He didn't last long, and he died. And so we find here that Asa, now in verse 8, reigned in his stead. And Asa reigned in verse 9, says, in the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, reigned Asa over Judah. Now, if you want to go through and add that up, this is the kind of thing that shows us that they began the years in different ways. That there's a consistency with the way you go through, and that is the key on it. Asa here becomes king. Now, Asa reigned for quite a while. He reigned for 41 years. And verse 11, Asa did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. He took away the Sodomites and removed the idols that his father had made, removed his mother from her status as queen because of an idol grove that she had, and he destroyed her idol. And he was wholehearted toward God, and he did a number of positive things in that regard. The account in Chronicles adds in a few details as we come back here in Second Chronicles chapter 14 and 15. It tells of how Asa sought to God to deliver him from the Ethiopians. It talks about in 2 Chronicles 15:10 how that, in verse 9, how Asa gathered all Judah and Benjamin and the strangers with him out of Ephraim and Manasseh and out of Simeon, for they fell to him out of Israel in abundance when they saw the Lord his God was with him. They gathered themselves together at Jerusalem in the 3rd month, the 15th year of the reign of Asa, and offered unto the Lord and entered into a covenant, verse 12. The 3rd month was the time of Pentecost. So there was a renewal of the covenant here at Pentecost, and Asa started out as many positive things. He got Judah prospered during his reign. But we find that as the years went by, complacency and pride came in. And later on, you see in chapter 16 of 2 Chronicles, it tells how when the nation was threatened, Asa took silver and gold out of the treasures of the house of the Lord. Chapter 16, verse 2. And when God's prophet corrected him on it, Asa got mad, verse 10, and threw him in jail. And then he got sick, and he had this disease in his feet, and he wouldn't go to God, and so he died. And he was a very stubborn individual, and time went. God had performed a tremendous miracle early in Asa's reign, and Asa was a man who was really oriented toward God, and things went along well for a long time. But he got in a situation years later, got scared, made a wrong decision. But the real crux of it came that when he was confronted with his problem, how did he receive correction? See, pride had come in now to where pride stood in his way of accepting correction, one of the things that pride does. And so Asa's pride was really his undoing. Now this is Rehoboam's grandson, Asa, or the great-grandson of King Solomon. Well, as we go on down through the story, this story back here in 2 Kings, we'll go back to the 2 Kings account, we find that Jeroboam's dynasty was overthrown by Baasha, and his dynasty didn't last long. Talks about 6th year of Asa. Elah, the son of Baasha, began to reign. He only reigned for 2 years, and Zimri, the captain of one of his army leaders, conspired and overthrew him. And you get a little bit of insight into the kind of leader Elah was, Baasha's son. Where was he? Well, he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of this fellow who was the steward of his house. So we see a little bit about him. Zimri just came in, smote him, and killed him. And he didn't last long. So now Zimri is set himself up. Zimri only reigned, he didn't last long. Verse 15, he reigned 7 days. And now one of the other generals conspires to overthrow Zimri, and his name is Omri. And in verse 16 it talks about Omri had his troops proclaim him as king, and he went up, verse 17, besieged Tirzah, and he won. He took over, and there are battles that go on, but Omri manages to consolidate power. We're told in verse 25 of 1 Kings 16, Omri wrought evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did worse than all that were before him. He walked in all the ways of Jeroboam and in his sins, and the rest of Omri's acts are written down, as it mentions, and he died and was buried there in Samaria. Now, Omri laid the foundation of one of the most dominant dynasty, the most famous dynasty in northern Israel. There's not a lot told about him here in 1 Kings, but when you go back in other places, there are references to Omri back in the book of Hosea, for instance. It talks about the things that had happened, and it talks about how that the statutes of Omri are kept. You know, that the people had laid aside God's law and had instead decided to, it refers, centuries later to the, or at least well over a century later, refers to the fact that they had cast away God's law and that they were keeping the statutes of Omri. Well, that tells you that Omri had quite a reputation as a lawgiver. And, God used Moses as his lawgiver to give his law to Israel. But here was a man that came along that obviously presented himself as quite a lawgiver. He was a great compiler of law. And he built the capital of Samaria, and he did various things. But he was a wicked king. He was an individual that just, further turned aside from, from God. And that the consequences were very strong. Another thing that he did was he entered into an alliance with the Baal-worshipping priest king of the Zidonians. And this man was, Ethbaal, and Omri arranged for the daughter of Ethbaal, whose name was Jezebel, to marry his son Ahab. And so Ahab and Jezebel become one of the most famous couples that you read about. And the thing that leads into the confrontation with Elijah. Now, in the meantime, down in Judah, when Asa dies, his son Jehoshaphat becomes king. Jehoshaphat, we're going to see, was a good king in many ways. He was humble, and his heart was right in terms of wanting to obey God, but he was an individual who was, let's say, not very perceptive of people. We're going to notice a little more on that. Now, Omri died, and Ahab became the new king of northern Israel. We find that in 1 Kings 16:30, Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. Verse 32, he reared up an altar for Baal. Verse 33, he made a grove, did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel before him. Now, this is the point in chapter 17 when Elijah comes on the scene. Elijah the Tishbite. And he was from the area of Gilead, and he showed up and told Ahab that it's not going to rain. And not going to rain until I ask for it to rain again. And so anyway, God then told Elijah to turn eastward and go here to this brook before the Jordan. And God provided for him, fed him with ravens and with the water and everything, and had the ravens bring him food. And after a while, the brook dried up because there was no rain. And he went along to Zarephath, and there was a widow woman. And God worked things out that here was a woman, and she was gathering sticks. And Elijah came and asked her for a little water to drink. And she started to go get that. And he said, by the way, he said, I'm hungry. Would you bring me something to eat, a little morsel of bread? And she said, in verse 12 of 1 Kings 17, look, she says, I don't have anything. She says, all I've got is a handful of meal in a barrel and a little oil in a cruse. And I'm gathering up these sticks. I'm going to make a little cake, build me a fire, cook it, My son and I are going to eat it. It's going to be our last meal, then we're going to die because there's no food to be had. And Elijah said, well, don't be afraid, verse 13. Go and do what you've said, but make me a little cake first and bring it to me, and then you and your son have the rest of it. Now, somebody might look at that and say, boy, Elijah was sure being selfish. Well, no. He gave her an opportunity to demonstrate her priorities and her faith. And she demonstrated it. She went and did just what he told her. And then the result, of course, was that she never ran out of meal. Every time she scooped down to get the last scoop out, there was just as much left as there was before. You couldn't scoop it all out. It just, kept coming. And the same thing with the oil. And this lasted until crops came in again, until it rained again. Well, mentions in verse 17 about her son dying. And Elijah took the son and took him up into the loft to a place where he had a little bed there and besought God for his intervention, and the child lived. The child came to life again. And God, verse 23, Elijah took down the child, brought him, and delivered him to the mother. And the woman said, verse 24, now by this I know that you're a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true. She could really totally see it. Now, she had stepped out on faith. It's interesting because the famous woman that came from Zidon was Jezebel. Here was a widow woman who came from Sarepta, which was, we're told, what pertained to Zidon. It was ruled by that. It was in that vicinity. She had a totally different attitude and perspective. And, God took care of her. One of the most simple principles in the entirety of the Bible, you follow it from Genesis to Revelation. And that is the fact that nobody ever really gets ahead by putting God last. And you never get behind by putting God first. It's a simple principle, and it follows all the way through. Here was a woman, and the way that God worked with her. Now, the third year came along since all of this, and God told Elijah, you need to go and show yourself to Ahab. I'm going to send rain. And there was a very difficult famine in Samaria, and Ahab had called this Obadiah, who was governor of his house, and they were out looking for a place to feed and water Ahab's livestock. And they were trying to find a place where they could move some of the livestock to. Now, here was Obadiah, who was right there, governor of Ahab's house, sort of a, chief servant there for him. And yet Obadiah was a man who feared God greatly in a difficult circumstance. When Jezebel had tried to kill all God's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 of them and hidden them in a couple of different caves and provided for them. Well, Elijah runs into Obadiah and he tells him that you need to go tell Ahab that I'm here. And Obadiah's first response is, this scares him, and he says, what have I done? What sin have I done that you're going to get me in this sort of trouble? He said, look, don't you realize how Ahab's been looking everywhere for you? We thought you must have disappeared off the face of the earth. He's looked everywhere. There's no kingdom or nation where my Lord is not sent to seek you. And he's taken an oath of that kingdom and that nation that they didn't find you there. He's been looking everywhere. Shows you, by the way, that Elijah was known to the leaders of the nations around there in that day. Because, he'd just been Joe Blow. You go in and ask, is he here? Well, we don't know, But in Elijah's case, they all knew who he was. And they said, no, he's not here. Well, Elijah was just a very low-profile area. He was staying up on a little sort of a loft that was connected here with this widow's house down in Sarepta. Nobody ever thought of looking for him there. They were, sending around. And so Obadiah was scared. He said, look, Ahab has looked for you everywhere. He's taken oaths of all the kings around. They all claim that you know where. He said, if I go and tell him that you're here and we come back here and the Spirit of the Lord's taking you away and you're not here, it's, it's going to be my neck. He's not going to take a joke very well. And Elijah said, look, I'll wait here. You just go ahead and do what I told you. I'll wait. And so Obadiah did, and Ahab came there. And first thing Ahab said when he saw Elijah, verse 17, oh, so you're the guy who's causing all the trouble. Are you the one that's troubling Israel? And Elijah said, no, I haven't troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have troubled Israel. You've forsaken the commandments and followed Baal. And he said, what I want you to do is gather everybody together at Mount Carmel. Get the priests of Baal there, all 400 of them, and gather the children of Israel. And so everybody was gathered together. And Elijah addressed the crowd in verse 21, and he said, how long halt you between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, and if Baal, then follow him. The people didn't say anything. So Elijah said, look, even I only remain a prophet of the Lord. Baal has 450. Let them therefore give us 2 bullocks. I'll give them first choice. They can pick whichever one they want, cut it in pieces, lay it on the wood, but don't put any fire under it. I'll dress the other bullock and lay it on the wood and put no fire under it. You priests of Baal, call on the name of your gods. I'll call on the name of the Eternal. And the God that answers by fire, let him be God. People said, oh, okay. We'll go along with that. So you remember the story. The priests of Baal dressed their oxen early that morning, and they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Nothing happened. They leaped upon the altar, into verse 26. And at noon, Elijah began to mock them. He began to just sort of make fun of them. And he said, well, you better cry a little louder. We probably can't hear you. He's talking, or he's pursuing, or he's on a journey. And, this term, he is pursuing, is a sort of a Hebrew euphemism that meant, he's going to the toilet. Elijah just, he just really sort of ridiculed him. Maybe he's gone to the bathroom. Maybe he's taken a trip. You just need to speak up. I don't think you guys are talking loud enough. So, there is a place for humor and even a little sarcasm in the appropriate circumstance. It's not, there's certainly plenty of inappropriate circumstances. But this was one, the point was Elijah was trying to, why was Elijah sarcastic here? Why was he saying some of this? He wanted the people to see how ridiculous this was. He was trying to make evident to the people how totally ridiculous it was that Baal was no God at all. There was no reality, there was no substance. Their choice was between something that is ridiculous and something that is true. And so he was, he did some of this, but he did it for effect. He wanted to emphasize to the people, because they were going to be confronted with a choice. And he wanted to show them how ridiculous this whole thing was. Well, you remember the story, of course. They came on down, and when it got to finally the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah had barrels of water dumped on his. He didn't want anybody to say, well, I've just been sort of sitting out there in the sun all day, and this spontaneous combustion. That must have been what it was. Dump water. Just dump water and dump water. I want this thing so soaked. I don't want anybody to think it was an accident or something that it's, I want you to clearly see and understand there is no natural explanation for this. It's a miracle of God. And so sure enough, he prayed to God, and the fire of God fell and consumed the burnt offerings, the wood, the stones, the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. I mean, this wasn't just ordinary fire. This was like a miniature nuclear explosion. I mean, it just, when it finished, not only was the sacrifice burned up, the wood was burned up, the stone altar was burned up, everything around there. I mean, it was just sort of a black hole. So that sort of got the point across. This was not just wasn't just a feeble little fire. When God gets ready to do something, He can do it in a way to stop the mouth of the gainsayers. When all the people saw it, they fell on their face and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Yeah, they were convinced for the next 5 minutes. Elijah had the priests of Baal executed. And he told Ahab, he says, "You better get up and eat and drink. There's a sound of abundance of rain." So Ahab went to eat and drink. And now Elijah went and he prayed. And told his servant, he said, "I want you to go look toward the sea." And the servant came back and said, "Well, I didn't see anything." Elijah said, "Well, go again." And he kept sending him back 7 times. Elijah's praying. He keeps sending the servant back. And finally, after the 7th time, the servant said, "Well, I do see this one little sort of wispy cloud way out there over the sea. And it sort of looks like a man's hand." And Elijah told him, he says, "Well, you go tell Ahab that he better prepare his chariot and get out because it's going to rain and not stop." And in the meantime, once the clouds started coming, they really started coming, and the heavens were black with clouds, and there was great rain, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And Elijah girded up his loins, and he ran. And he evidently made as good a time through the mud as Ahab and his chariot did. Ahab came in, first thing he did was, chapter 19, was tell Jezebel that what all had happened. And Jezebel was not happy. That's sort of the understatement. She sent word to Elijah and she said, "I'm going to kill you. You're going to be dead." Well, the result, of course, was that Elijah, who, had thought, you see, you get your hopes up. Elijah, now it's like the problems are behind. He's gone through the struggle, he's gone through all this stuff, and now, it's finally over. And boy, he's just, ready to relax. And no, it's not all over. Jezebel's going to kill you. Well, that was just it. And he was just discouraged, took off, running, getting away. And it tells the story here of how God dealt with him and provided for him. And how he went there to Horeb, to the mountain of God. And it really was convinced, God said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, life's really rough. Everybody has forsaken you. I've really been zealous, and everybody's forsaken you. They've thrown down your altars and slain your prophets, and I'm the only one left." Finally God told him, he said, "Well, there are 7,000 that haven't bowed their knees to Baal. It's bad, but it's not as bad as what you think." So Elijah was sent now to complete his ministry. The story as we come on down, and here in chapter 26, we begin to, or in chapter 20, excuse me, that there's a battle with the Syrians, and in chapter 21 we come to the account of Naboth's vineyard. Naboth had a vineyard that was near some property that Ahab had. Ahab wanted the vineyard. Naboth wouldn't sell it to him. Jezebel said, "I'll take care of that." She carried out the situation and wound up with trumped up charges accusing Naboth of blasphemy and had him executed and took his property. Well, God sent word by Elijah to Ahab. Elijah went down chapter 21, verse 18. And Elijah told him that in the place, into verse 19, in the place where the dogs lick the blood of Naboth, they're going to lick your blood, even yours. And Elijah told Ahab what the situation was and how his dynasty was going to be wiped out like the dynasty of Jeroboam, verse 22. And the dogs are going to eat Jezebel, verse 23. So, verse 25 is interesting. It says, there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. She was the real power behind the throne. He did very abominably. Well, when Ahab heard these words, verse 27, he rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his flesh, fasted and lay in sackcloth and went softly. He was sort of scared, to put it mildly. He didn't repent, really, but he walked softly for a while. And even that, God's merciful. And God looked and told Elijah, he said, you see, verse 29, how Ahab humbles himself. I'm not going to do all these things in his lifetime, but I will bring it on the family. Well, things continued on. There was war for 3 years here between Syria and Israel. And Jehoshaphat, chapter 22, verse 2, king of Judah, came down to the king of Israel. And Ahab sort of leaned on him. He said, Ramoth Gilead, that's ours. And, the king of Syria has taken that away from us and I can't get it back. Will you come help me? Now, Jehoshaphat was the kind of fellow who felt sorry for other folks. And he was always trying to help bail people out of stuff. The problem was, Ahab deserved to be in the mess that he was in. The reason Ahab was in the mess that he was because of the way he lived and the fact that God wasn't blessing him. But he played on Jehoshaphat's sympathy, and Jehoshaphat felt sorry for him. Now, as you go through the story of Jehoshaphat, and particularly when you go back to Chronicles, you find Jehoshaphat was a man, he was faithful to God. He sent the priests out to teach throughout the land. He was a very sincere man. But he was the kind of person who was sort of gullible where people were concerned, and Ahab, well, as the old saying was, Ahab just played him like a fiddle. He was always able to use Jehoshaphat. And this is one example of that. And in this particular account here in chapter 22, Jehoshaphat agreed to help him. And but then he said, Ahab had all these priests of Baal there, these pagan priests, and Jehoshaphat said, I'd really like to talk to a priest of God. Don't you have a prophet of God here? And Ahab said, well, we got one, Micaiah, son of Imlah. I don't like him. He never has anything good to say. Ahab liked his preachers to say nice things. He went to church to feel good about himself. And if the trouble was, the sermons Ahab heard from Elijah and Micaiah didn't leave him feeling very good about himself. That was because there wasn't much good there. He shouldn't have felt good about himself. What he should have done was changed and repented. But Ahab liked for somebody to just, sort of make him feel good. And he never got that from Micaiah. So he didn't want to call him, but he did at Jehoshaphat's insistence. And Micaiah came down there, and first he gave him sort of a little bit of a sarcastic answer. And I guess Ahab could tell that he was being sarcastic, and he got upset and said, I want you to tell me the truth. How many times have I told you, tell me the truth? Well, that was probably the first time he'd ever said it, but Micaiah looked at him and he said, I'll tell you exactly what the truth is. He said, I saw Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Go on out there, go to battle. You're going to die. Well, Ahab then turned to Jehoshaphat and said, "See, didn't I tell you? He never has anything good to say." That's in verse 18. Didn't I tell you he'd prophesy no good? I knew it. You know, that's why I didn't want to ask him down here. Now, again, to show you a little bit about Jehoshaphat, as you come on down through, notice in verse 30, or verse 29, Ahab and Jehoshaphat went up to Ramoth Gilead. In verse 30, the king of Israel, Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, "I'll disguise myself and enter into battle. But you go ahead and put on your robes." Now, you know, you would think the light would have come on. Wait a minute. Why are you going to disguise yourself? Because you don't want to be shot at out there. See, the prophecy has been made, the king's going to die. So you're not going to dress up like the king. You're going to put on some old grubby stuff and go out there and look like a common soldier. But you want me to put on my robes and my crown and to go out there, you know, and really be the only guy out there looking like a king. And, you know, you would think a person would sort of say, you know, I don't really think he has my best interests at heart. But Jehoshaphat, and I've known people like that, you know, there was not a deceitful bone in his body, and he had trouble believing. He just didn't think the worst of people. He wasn't up to all sort of sneaky ulterior things, and it was hard for him to believe that anybody else was. And he just, you know, was one of these guys, he always saw the good in people. He saw the good in Ahab when there really wasn't any good, but he sort of felt sorry for him. He was trying to help him out. Ahab played on his sympathy. "Oh, you know, we've lost this part of our territory, and we really need to get it back, and won't you help me?" So they come down there, and sure enough, verse 32, Jehoshaphat was spotted, and they said, "Ha, it's the king of Israel." And they took off after him. And Jehoshaphat cried out, you know, just asked God, "Oh, please help me, you know, what a mess I'm in." And God had mercy on Jehoshaphat. They recognized that it wasn't Ahab and turned aside. Ahab, who thought he was going to outsmart God, you can't outsmart God. Somebody just sort of took a, quote, lucky shot. They just shot an arrow in the sort of the general direction. And what did it do? Was it hit Ahab. They didn't know who they were shooting at, but it all worked out, and Ahab died, and his son Ahaziah reigned in his stead. And Jehoshaphat reigned 25 years, we're told in verse 42. In verse 43, he walked in all the ways of Asa his father, turned not aside from it. He made peace with the king of Israel, all the things that he did. He got rid of the last of the Sodomites. He made, verse 48, he made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold. But they went not, for the ships were broken at Ezion Geber. And what you find is, when you put the account together in Chronicles, that the king of Israel, Ahaziah, had come up with this idea, you know, why don't we go in the shipping business? Tell you what, you come up with the money and the ships, and we'll use your port, and I can sort of maybe provide a few guys, and we'll split things 50-50. So Jehoshaphat fell for it. But even Jehoshaphat learned, because he didn't fall for it the second time. See, he fell for it and got in this deal. Well, the ships were broken up. And God's prophet came to him and said, "Why are you helping the ungodly? You know, how can you expect to be blessed in this situation because you have made yourself a partner with somebody that God's putting a curse on?" So if God's going to put a curse on him because of his disobedience, and you're going to be his partner, you're going to wind up in trouble too. And that is the story. This you find back in, I'll just read you from 2 Chronicles 20, that verse 35, "After this did Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, join himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who did very wickedly. He joined himself with him to make ships to go to Tarshish. And they made the ships at Ezion Geber, which was Jehoshaphat's port. And God's prophet said, you know, because you joined yourself with Ahaziah, the Lord has broken your works. So the ships were broken. They weren't able to go to Tarshish. And then 2 Kings tells us that in chapter 22, verse 49, that Ahaziah came back to Jehoshaphat and said, well, let's go back and try it a second time. My servants will go with your servants. And Jehoshaphat wouldn't do it. He'd learned a little bit. No, I think I better do that again. And Jehoshaphat died, and he had a son by the name of Ahaziah also. So he had two kings. King of Israel and king of Judah had the same name. That makes it real easy to keep it separated here. As you come on down, Ahaziah was reigned over Judah over Israel for a short time, and did evil in the sight of the Lord, as all of that group was doing. And he had a son by the name of Joram, Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram. So they were they were also interrelated, because Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram, had married the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Her name was Athaliah, and that story we'll get into in the next Bible study. But as you go through here, now we'll just begin into 2 Kings as we sort of wrap up the ministry of Elijah coming down. Elijah has been God's servant, God's prophet through the reigns of Ahab of Israel and Jehoshaphat of Judah. Primarily, Elijah has been dealing with Israel. Well, Elijah now is going to. God is ready for Elijah's ministry to come to a conclusion, and God is going to take him up into heaven by a whirlwind. We're told in 2 Kings 2 verse 1. Now, what we're going to see is which heaven. What heaven will a whirlwind take you up in? The Bible speaks of three heavens. First is the heaven of the earth's atmosphere, the birds of heaven, the clouds of heaven. The second heaven is the heaven of outer space, the sun and the moon, in the heavens. And then there's what the New Testament calls in 2 Corinthians the third heaven, the place of God's abode. Well, a whirlwind will only take you up into the earth's atmosphere, and that is the heaven that Elijah was taken into. Now, we read here in 2 Kings 2, it talks about Elijah going with Elisha from Gilgal, and they came there to Bethel and went down from Bethel to Jericho. And these were the three schools of the prophets, or colleges in our terminology, that Elijah had. And he sort of made the rounds one last time visiting those. And it was known that Elijah was going to be taken away by God. Well, Elisha is going with him, and Elijah took his mantle and smote the waters, and the Jordan parted, and they came across. And Elisha asks Elijah for a double portion of your spirit. Now, what does that mean? Well, Elisha had been told earlier, he knew that he had been anointed or chosen to be Elijah's heir. In one sense, the sons of the prophets, as it talks about here, were sort of the collective heirs of the ministry of Elijah. Elisha was in the role of the firstborn. If the father had a number of children, the firstborn received a double portion. And that's in effect what Elisha was asking for. He had a big job to carry out if he was going to be the one to follow in Elijah's office. And so he asked that, along with that, if he was going to lead all the others, that he would, in a sense, have a double portion, that he would not twice as much as Elijah had, but have, in that sense, the it was like you would say, the portion of the firstborn. He would have that extra help and strength from God that would enable him to sort of stand out above the others and to be able to lead and to do the things he needed to do. And Elijah said, well, if God lets you see me be taken up, then that'll be the case. And so sure enough, the chariot of fire appeared, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind in verse 11. And Elisha saw it. And as they came back over the Jordan, he took Elijah's mantle, which he had caught, and smote the waters, and they parted. And so they, what everyone recognized at that point, verse 15, the spirit of Elijah does rest on Elisha. And notice they didn't have any illusion that he'd gone off to the heaven of God's abode. They expected that he was somewhere else on earth, and they thought, well, maybe he's somewhere close. Verse 16, they said, why don't we go and seek your master? You know, he may be in some mountain or some valley nearby. Elisha told them not to. He knew that wasn't, God had taken him away. He didn't want him found, but they kept urging him until finally he said, well, all right, go ahead. And they looked for 3 days, and of course they didn't find him. And so God then worked here through certain miracles, showing very clearly that Elisha was the successor to Elijah. Specific miracles that enabled people to see that, including the miracles that Elijah himself had worked. Elisha worked similar ones. So God worked through that. One of the things that we find as we go all the way through the Bible is that God has always had His work. He's always had His true servants there to deliver His message. And that just, when one servant of God is taken away or dies, another one comes along and takes his place. It just, it's a long continuum all the way down. For people to think, well, because one servant of God died, then evidently the work must be over with. Well, they don't understand the work. The work started at the beginning, and it's going to last till the end. And God keeps on, and God raises up, just as He raised up Elisha after Elijah. And you can go through every example. God always had. There was always somebody that was there. God was going to have that continuation. Well, as you have your chart, we're going to pick it up next time. With the conclusion, we'll go through the ministry of Elisha, and then we will pick up speed to come on through the kings of Judah and Israel here with the things that transpired. So with that, we'll be concluded on the Bible study, and I've got questions for next time.